Welcome, writers. I'm Ryan, and I have a question for you. Do you ever find yourself struggling with momentum or focus after the first 100 pages of your novel? Have you ever experienced a sagging middle? Have you ever had trouble crafting the ending of your book or trying to figure out exactly where to start your novel to begin with? Well, if any of that sounds familiar, then today's show may just be the help that you need. In this chat with NINC member Michele Dunaway, Gregory Frost, author of the RHYMER Trilogy and longtime writing teacher, talks about how he finds the spark for a story, how to diagnose a sagging draft, and how to craft a satisfying ending to your story. So, buckle up. Here we go.
While Novelists Inc., NINC, strives to provide accurate and helpful information, NINC does not assume any liability for or endorse any opinions, advice, instructions, products, errors, or omissions in the following video. Viewers are solely responsible for how they interpret and apply any NINC content.
Hey everyone, I am Michele Dunaway, and I'm here with Gregory Frost, who writes across all genres, writing science fiction and horror and a few other things that he's going to talk about, because today's topic is we are going to be talking about beginnings, middles, and ends. So Greg, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And so tell me, I'm so glad. So tell me about, I know it's kind of chaos in both of our worlds, everyone, but here we go.
Yeah.
So tell me, after decades of writing, how has your sense of what made a story sort of changed? What do you know now about the shape of the narrative that maybe you didn't understand when you were starting out, or just how has your focus across the genres changed?
Well, the main takeaway, I guess, from that, or the main thing that's changed from when I started writing or trying to write stories and broke into print, is the understanding that what you start out with doesn't have to look anything like what you end up with. And I've taught a lot of workshops, I've taught in MFA programs, and we're always analyzing stories. We're always looking at successful stories and go, what did the author do here that works so well? And I think writers should be asking those kinds of questions of stories that they read too. Is like, why do I like this story so much? What worked here? What can I take away from it? What can I steal? That isn't nailed down. But the thing about that is, we're always looking at finished works, and in most cases, we don't have any idea what the author started out with or what their first draft looked like, compared to this gem that we're analyzing, this great story. So we're analyzing the final draft, but in some ways that leads us to ask the wrong questions about writing as writers, because I want to know what the writer thought they were writing, and how far from the starting position they ended up. And that's something you really can't tell by looking at a finished work. You don't know. You're looking at the collection of choices that they made and stuck with, the choices that worked for them. You're not looking at everything they discarded, everything they tried out and didn't work, et cetera, all the way through. And in my own experience, after all these years, I think stories an ever-changing shape when I'm writing a story. As for what makes a story, sort of the second half of your question, I guess. Actually, I guess that was the first half of your question. I think it has to do mostly with the ending more than anything else. I think that the ending you supply to a story either has to resolve the problem that's been explored, especially throughout the middle of the story, or the ending has to resonate. And in that sense, I mean, it's playing upon images and emotions, things that are embedded in the story from the beginning. And what that means also is it's usually pulling on some threads from the beginning of the story. Only now those things have maybe taken on a new meaning, they've changed, they've evolved throughout the story. And I think if it doesn't resolve or it doesn't resonate, one of those two things, it's likely going to be an unsatisfying story for the reader.
So do you sometimes find, because I know I do, that I will get to a certain point and then I will go maybe fix the beginning of my story or change the beginning of my story because it went a different direction than I thought it would?
Well, I think that's going on all the time.
Okay.
You know, there's a phenomenon with novels in particular called the 100-page wall, which you know, you might be familiar with. I don't know. And this is the notion that just on the excitement of writing the story, the idea that you've got, you can get about 100 pages through your novel, by which point you start to kind of lose your nerve and you look back at the 100 pages you've written and probably you see a lot of things that you've decided you want to change anyway, now that you've gotten 100 pages through it, and you look ahead and there's nothing there because you haven't written anything yet. It's all blank. And so as a writer, you lose your nerve and you go, okay, I'm going to go back and start over again now because I know all these things that I need to change anyway. I'm going to fix this. And so you start out and you get about 100 pages through the story, at which point you look back and you go, oh, well, I've got all these things now that I've really figured out. Now I'm going to go back and write. So it's, it's lather, rinse, and repeat. It just goes on and on like that. Mostly because until you've, I think, gotten to the end of your story, you're editing or revising a hypothetical. It doesn't even exist yet. And the odds are you as much chance of damaging the narrative, the story, the idea you had as you have of fixing it at that point because it doesn't exist yet. And I think you really have to sort of put that aside and keep going all the way through the end of the story. And then look at it from an editing standpoint, come back and
So in
fix it.
essence, kind of what I'm hearing you say is just get it to the end, if nothing else, first, because I know sometimes beginning writers, they just, like you just said, keep working and working, and they never make it over sort of that middle hump to get
Right.
to the end. So basically just get it so that you have an idea of where that ending, is for the story, because sometimes it surprises me. I mean, and
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think you have as much likelihood, as I say, of damaging the story you're writing because you're editing, if you will, hypothetical. You're imagining the 200 pages you haven't written yet. And you're making decisions on the basis of what you think those 200 pages are going to be. But you're already looking at the 100 pages you've written and you're making changes to those. So we can kind of guess that for the next 200 pages, you're going to have other changes too. And you may get to the ending of the story and it may turn out to be something you hadn't anticipated. So yeah, I think you have as much likelihood of damaging the thing as you do of finishing it correctly until you've got a complete draft of the story and you know that the shape or a shape anyway that it's got, that now you can start working with it. Now you can lay on the hands and pray and figure out whatever it needs because
I
then it's real.
I think that's fabulous. I'm going to be honest. I mean, I've been doing this 25 years and I never really heard it put so succinctly on that idea of the first 100 pages, because I draft from page 1 all the way until the end. And sometimes I get in the middle and I'm like, this story absolutely sucks.
Yeah.
But I just have to keep going. And I'm like, I can fix it later, or I can figure it out later. Because there are times when I don't even know what the theme is, if the conflict is, or anything like that until I get to the end. And I write romance and I already know what the end is going to be because it has to be happily ever after. Because I mean, I don't have horror or a mystery where it gets to be, oh, surprise.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone knows how my book ends right at the very beginning. And so so what do you think a beginning needs to do beyond that usual, advice of just, oh, it's got to hook the reader and contain that inciting incident and, introduce us to our, characters?
Well, I think the beginning has a very specific job it has to do. Um, I mean, yes, there are hooks, if you will, or inciting incidents that you have to put into the beginning, but I think to borrow from somebody like Joyce Carol Oates, who's one of the most prolific writers I can think of, um, she mentioned in some essay someplace that the beginning of her stories is the last thing she writes.
Okay.
Um, and probably the thing that gets the most attention, the most revision, the most, editing, changing, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and again, I think that goes back to this idea that you have to have a whole story before you can go back and correctly adjust the beginning and make that work. Um, but I also think the beginning of the story kind of boils down to this. It's almost a cliche anymore, that things are not as they seem. You can pretty much take any story and that's kind of how it comes out. Um, at the beginning of the story, as readers, we don't know anything. We know absolutely nothing. So we're relying upon the author to fill up, what we need in order to forge ahead. And that doesn't mean that you plant a huge info dump at the beginning of the story, and give us like the history of the universe or the history of space travel,
Mhm.
or we don't need that in order to enjoy the story or to get going in the story. And also, I think in the beginning, maybe the writer doesn't know very much about the story either. And so what happens sometimes is they commence to tell themselves the story that they're going to write. Um, and they sort of write that history or whatever it is that they have to write in order to get going with the story. Um, but they may not necessarily know what's important at that point. Um, and it kind of ties into one of the most common critiques that I've heard in workshops, which is somebody telling the writer that your story actually starts on page 3, because that writer has done exactly that. They've sort of told themselves the story that they're going to write. And, they've sort of written the stuff for themselves. And then at some point, they hit what
Mhm.
actually is the first line of their story. Um, and the mistake that I think a lot of beginning writers make then is that they leave that stuff in there because it got them to the end of their draft. So it must be the beginning of the story. And it never occurs to them that that's not really what it did, or that's not really what it's doing. So yeah. Um,
So let's kind of move to these middles because that middle is basically where a lot of writers struggle. We call it that sagging middle and such. And so what would be a strategy to kind of get through that, to get to that ending for those of people who may not know the ending? I have a good friend who writes cozy mysteries, and she came to talk to my class once, and Lynn Cahoon, and she was like, a lot of times I don't know who done it until almost the end of my story, and then it reveals itself to me. So I know a lot of writers, sometimes very successful writers, don't necessarily know how their books are going to end yet, but you get into that middle, and you still have to figure, how to keep pushing through it. What's some advice you may have for that?
well, the middle is the vast majority of your story or your novel. The writer David Morrell, I think in an essay someplace, he said the beginning of your story is like 1/7 of it, and the ending of your story is about 1/7 of it, and the middle is 5/7. So the middle is huge, and I don't know if those proportions are accurate or not, but that's what he used. Um, so I think, when you look at books on writing or workshops or lectures on writing, people talk about the beginnings, they talk about the endings because those are the small things that have very specific jobs to do. So you can talk about them in a way that it's very hard to talk about the middles because they're enormous and there are a lot of pathways through the middle of a story or potential pathways. You can go in all kinds of directions. and still arrive at that ending that you wanted to arrive at or wanted to reach. And a couple years ago, I was having some kind of discussion with my friend Michael Swanwick, and Michael talked about how when he first moved to Philadelphia, he met up with the authors Gardner Dozois and Jack Dan, and they sort of took him under wing and mentored him a little bit. And he said that one of the great revelations they bestowed upon him was this idea that you did not have to write the story you thought you were writing, that you could shred the whole thing and go in an entirely different way at any point in the drafting of that story, and that nothing was set in stone, which seems like kind of an obvious point, but I suspect a lot of fledgling writers are just writing what they think is supposed to come next based on what they thought or envisioned at the start or what they think they're supposed to do. And it doesn't occur to them that they don't have to follow those rules. They can completely throw that rule book out and go a completely different route than they thought they were going to go at the beginning of the story. And in the process, discover a much better story because you have the freedom to sort of flex your writing muscles or what have you, and do that.
Can you give me an example of that from perhaps one of the times when you were writing one of your works?
An example of it changing shape.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. A book actually that I'm bringing out through Bookview Cafe, or bringing out for the second time through Bookview Cafe this summer, is a novel called Shadow Bridge. And Shadow Bridge was a novel that the first half of it, I probably spent something like 7 years playing around with the ideas of storytelling. It's about a shadow puppeteer. So it's actually a novel about the power of stories and telling stories and collecting stories and so forth. So there's a lot of reference to folk tales and fairy tales that are kind of like the folk tales and fairy tales of our world, but slightly weird and skewed and revised by this in this other world. So as I say, the first half of that book took years because I was playing with the ideas and I was in no hurry to sort of rush through them. And then I sold it to Del Rey, and then I had like 6 months to come up with the second half of the novel. It's like, oh God, and now I've got to do this for real. I don't have the luxury of spending all this time spinning these very different stories out. So there was a real sense of, I have no idea what the middle of this is. I'm just going to go. And I had no time to do anything else because suddenly I had a deadline that I hadn't had to deal with before. And it was like, this is just how it's going to be. So whatever falls out, falls out. And fortunately, I had a pretty good idea of where this story was going to end. So in a lot of ways, that second half of the middle was, it almost didn't matter. Whatever stories fit the larger story, the larger framework, they were going to work. They had no choice but to work, and I had no choice but to make sure that they worked. So, but it was different. It was a panic that that propelled me through it. It's amazing what a deadline can do for you as far as that goes. It's like, oh my God, yeah.
Oh, I'm on a big one right now, actually. We are getting there, which is a good thing, but it is a lot of pressure. But I've discovered sometimes too that when you have that pressure on yourself, that your brain makes it happen. Like the magic occurs that,
Yep.
you don't get to just sort of hem and haw on it or spend time. It's just your brain knows, okay, I have to produce, I have to hit this deadline. I have to make the story come to life in a sense.
Yeah.
Where, sometimes before that I'm just like, it'll happen when it happens. So
Yeah. Exactly. exactly
Yeah,
true.
it'll
Yeah.
happen. The characters will tell me. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they don't like to talk. So how do you, besides a deadline, actually, especially for those newbies or people that do get in that rut, how do you sustain your own belief in a project when you're in that long middle stretch, or when you're in the trenches going, I need 80,000 words, I've got 20, and oh my God, I'm nowhere close.
Um, that's kind of like, well, what do you, I don't know, what do you say to yourself? What do you ask yourself as you go through? Um, I guess, I mean, there are a lot of questions you can ask yourself when you're in the middle of a story. You can ask things like, what would it improve my story to have it intersect or crash into another story? I think a lot of times people start out just writing one story all the way through to the end, and it never occurs to them that one of the shapes that's really interesting in fiction is where what you think is the main story comes along and it kind of crashes into this other story, and it changes the trajectory. It changes the direction of your story. So you can ask that, like, should I introduce a second story to it? Or you can kind of look at it and go, well, am I writing just the external story? And have I somehow failed to include a personal story with that? If that makes any sense. Because I think every story actually has this sort of two shells, if you were, around it. One is the big story you're writing about, and the other is a personal story embedded somewhere in that big story. It's like, well, it's really nice to hear about the Hundred Years' War. That's an interesting subject, but maybe it would be a good idea if we picked one character to fictionalize within that larger narrative, because that's a lot of people.
Right.
Like pick Joan of Navarre. Okay, she's an interesting character. Write about her. Find ways to make your points, the elements of your narrative, deal with this one specific person. Um, it's all well and good to have that kind of epic framework, but I don't know, look at Game of Thrones. Look how many personal stories there are inside that epic frame of
Mhm.
Game of Thrones, and that's what you really want to be writing about is the personal stories that are embedded in that. Um,
I think that's important. I used to teach that to my journalism students, that stories are about people. They aren't
mhm.
really about things or events. And the angle of your story, and especially in like newsprint and so forth, or even, media, comes from that personal angle that they put on that story. So I think in fiction, that is sort of the same thing. That
Yeah,
it's some people say, well, it's a plot driven story or it's a character driven story, but yet we know that in order to go along with the story, we're going to have to somehow relate to the characters in some way, that we want to go on that journey with them, that plot. If
yeah,
not, I mean, we're just changing the channel. The attention spans, people don't have those like they did, because as people would say, if I'm reading about, say, a serial killer, why am I reading that story? I may not empathize with them, I not relate to them, but I'm curious enough that I want to see where this is going, even if we're working with an anti-hero type character,
sure.
like say a Dexter, on that show, or, there's others where, you're looking and you're like, well, this is not necessarily a good person, but we're with it on this storyline to figure out what's happening. So do you write like known conclusions for your characters? Or, I mean, like we said, we've talked a little bit about that, but can you give me an example maybe where the ending revealed itself along the way, or you already knew it and you built toward it? Just, something that might reassure someone that they're on the right track.
Um, Gee, let me think about that. Um,
Sorry.
Dead
Didn't mean
end.
to.
That's just what you didn't want.
Yeah,
Um,
no, it's okay. No, I mean, sometimes I just am like, oh, wow, this is going to end here this way for my characters. And sometimes, what I think is going to happen doesn't. Other times I know exactly how the book is going to end, even though I haven't written a
sure.
word. I just have a general idea, oh, I need to end here in order to make the series work.
Yeah, frequently, I think in my case, the ending may be the one thing that I think that I know for certain, and the rest of it is just, you know, nebulous and will
Right.
sort of gather as I go. So I can see the destination, and the
I,
task in a way is to find a path to get me there.
I like that. I'm going to interrupt you here just a little bit because I do like that as we're, talking and depending on who's viewing it, because I did a road trip. And whenever I do a road trip, it's really funny. I said, I always know where I'm ending for the night. I never know where I'm going in between there. Sometimes I do, but a lot of times I know where I'm going to the end of the night, but I don't necessarily know, where I'm going to be along the way. I kind of like, oh, there's a roadside, thing. I think I want to see that, or oh, that looks interesting. I think I want to stop, and just know that at the end of the night, I've got a hotel or something waiting for me. And that might,
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of applies to fiction too. Sometimes we get to take detours and we get to stop as long as we sort of know, well, this was an important place where we need to be at this point.
Well, it's funny actually because that kind of relates to um, a comment that Nancy Kress made some years ago to the effect that writing a novel is like driving across country at night, in the sense that you can only see as far ahead as your headlights. So all you know is what you can see in that light. You know your destination is out there someplace, but it's going to be days and days and days before you get anywhere near that. And it's kind of analogous to that, in that you're trusting the process of writing is going to get you there. Um, and as a writer who's written, a number of books, you know that you can trust that process because it does work. It has gotten you through any number of adventures, stories that you've written. Um, but still, you're kind of predicting or hoping that all of that material is out there and that you're going to encounter it. So yeah, you want to have a place to stay for the night, but tomorrow you got to get up and you got to
Mm.
keep driving into the unknown. And,
Got to
and
keep going.
that's what writing is. I mean, like, so I wrote this trilogy called the RHYMER Trilogy for Baen Books, and the third novel in that trilogy, which is RHYMER Hell, um, I knew that the ending had to tie up uh, most of the major plot threads. But at the same time, I wanted to have the potential for it to be open-ended in case Baen Books said, hey, we want a fourth book. Um, so early on, I wrote down a sequence of events that I anticipated were going to be the ending of the story. And even though I had done that and in pretty solid detail, it didn't go quite the way I thought it would. It still changed, despite all that preparation. And again, I think you have to be flexible enough to say it's going to change. It's going to go someplace that the story needs to go, not necessarily where I think it needs to go starting out. Um, so I mean, in a sense, you're giving yourself a target to aim at, but you have to be willing to revise that or even scratch it completely if things shift on you. So it's hard to, I mean, if you're halfway through your story or your novel and you figure out what the ending of that is, I think it's a good idea to sit down and like write that ending out in one sentence. Just tell yourself what the ending of this story is going to be. And then you can use that to revise the story. You can use that to direct the story, aim the story as you go along. Um, and sometimes that'll be wrong too. And you kind of have to embrace the fact that, yeah, occasionally things are not going to be the way you think they are. And sometimes that's better, uh, better than what you started out thinking, at the beginning. And I write from, I think from a perspective of chaos, in the initial drafts, especially like the first maybe 50 pages or so before I've even done anything like an outline. I tend to write a kind of chaos draft just to see if the story idea actually has legs.
Okay.
And, and then maybe I'll come back and outline it at that point. Because now I feel as though I'm invested in it, and it feels like it's churning with something that's alive. So
Those are good points. And I did want to circle back just a little bit to the fact that you were like, well, we left it a little open-ended. Some writers are like, oh, I'm going to create a series, so I've got to end on a cliffhanger in every book. I mean, is that a good idea? Or is there a way to do that so that the reader isn't disappointed? I know I had one book one time by a really popular author that kind of ended on a cliffhanger, but the story had wrapped up, but then now what he was doing was introducing the next story that was coming later. But so I was okay with that, but at the same time, I mean, I've read others where I'm like, wait, this sucks. You know what I mean? Like I'm like this was not, I got to hear and this was it. I mean, I'll be honest, I read sometimes the endings first before I even read the book. That's me.
oh,
Because I
okay.
have gotten to them where I've been disappointed and I'm like, I don't want to spend, 90,000 words to get to an ending that I might not be happy with. You know,
Yeah.
my
Well,
time's valuable.
yeah.
I know.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, I'll get in trouble for this, but I kind of felt that way about the Hunger Games. I got really tired of the fact that every single chapter had to end on a cliffhanger. Like after a while, I'm going, can't we just sit down and have a meal and not worry about a cliffhanger for a change, just to be different. So for me, that particular structure got to be exhausting after a while.
Mhm.
So I think that it's unnecessary to have to rely on that kind of artificial instruction over and over and over again. Yeah, cliffhangers are great. Do they pull you along to the next chapter, of course. But you can also get pulled into the next chapter simply by asking questions within the story that aren't getting answered yet.
Okay.
And we still want to know what those answers are. And those answers might be 50 pages or 100 pages down the road. So I don't think you have to set up the cliffhanger, section after section after section. I think there are other ways you can keep the reader engaged, if you will.
Yeah, I think real popular right now are, and you may not have read them, but in the romance genres, Rachel Reed's Game Changer series with the heated rivalry that was just out on, HBO Max and on Crave in Canada. And episode 5, which everybody loves, ends with the line, I'm coming to the cottage. And then it just cuts off. And when people be like, oh, well, that's a cliffhanger. And in a way, no, it really wasn't. It was just, he's like, okay, we've got the conclusion. Now we know that we are, going to get to the end where the rest of it happens. But, that idea of, like you said, okay, the questions are, all right, now what? Because we know that finally these characters are going to, be together, but they still have things that they have to resolve. And so we want
Sure.
that satisfying ending where I think just like you were mentioning with some things where it's like a cliffhanger, it's not even you get tired, it's almost sort of whiplash. Like you said, you're just like ba-doom, ba-doom, and it's almost like kind of the waves hitting you all the time. And so I think that, cliffhangers can be great, but at the same time, I think there's a way, like you said, to add that punch
Yeah.
where the reader just will go with you because they are so invested at this point that, you know, it might be just there's a meal and we're like, and I mean, Westerns were always like that, wasn't it? They're all, or even old military type things. They're all sitting down for the meal and you know that next thing they're doing, they're going off to battle and that's going to be the next chapter. So we are going to turn the page, even though they were all just like, all right, it's time to bed. We're all going to get up in the morning and off we go.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
so, so I think that, for a new, like newbies, it's sort of, we hear that all the time, but the readers, they will come with you when they're invested in your characters and,
Exactly. Yeah.
wanting to know, okay, how are they going to solve these problems, that they've got, and so forth. And so if you could give one piece of advice, to a writer working on, say, their first novel or story collection, what would it be?
It would probably be something like just get it down on the page. Because again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, I think once the material is written down, even if it's totally wrong, you have something to work with. Even if you're just going to stomp on it or set it on fire, you've got something to work with. And to a great extent, I think the physical act of writing scenes and stories and chapters is again throwing a spotlight, if you will, on what was vague and murky. And each time you write another sentence, you're sort of pushing it light ahead of you, just like Nancy Kress was saying. Samuel Delany wrote a great essay that was supposed to be about plot, where he said he didn't trust plot and instead he was going to write about the process of writing. And he just talks about how for him, writing is like being in a darkened theater and you write one sentence and that shines a spotlight on a particular thing on the stage. And that kind of casts something else into it's slightly illuminated. So you write another sentence and that lights up and so on and so forth. And for him, that's kind of what writing is like everything you write is lighting up more and more and more of the story. And I think that's really the case. So for me, that's the biggest advice is get it down on the page. Because I honestly think that a lot of people sort of create their own version of writer's block by thinking that they must get this right. It's has to be right the first time I set it down. And as a result, they don't actually ever put anything down in the page. They're working with it in their head all the time. And that doesn't go anywhere. And that, you can edit whatever's in your head forever, because there aren't any constraints to that. And so as a result, I think those people don't actually write anything. They just think about writing something real soon now. And I think that's a dead end. I think that really is a kind of preemptive writer's block. Is just not, you don't have to write anything because you can't figure out what the right thing is. And that kind of harkens back to what I'm saying about workshops and such. We're looking at finished stories. We're not looking at first drafts, and it sort of misrepresents what that process actually feels like, looks like, et cetera, that most writers, I think, or all writers go through in one form or another, regardless of what your process actually is.
No, I think that's an excellent point. I know sometimes I get my line edits back from the very final read. It can happen as well. And I just remember reading it and I'm laughing in certain places and I'm doing something and I'm like, who wrote this? And I'm like, oh my God, I did. You know what I mean? Because when I'm like, wow, this is actually really good. Because when I'm writing it, it's ugly. It's pulling teeth. And I'm just like, I hate these people. I hate this story, and then when I get it
Yeah.
back after it's been all prettied up by the copy editor and my editor and me going through and doing some revisions based on suddenly I'm like, wow, this is really good. I'm really enjoying this. And it was like, and that moment for me is where it's what it's about. Because like I said, when I'm going through it, it's, I like the end product, but when I'm going through it, sometimes it's basically like, being in PE class over and over and over again, or you're practicing all the time and it like this practice just sucks. But then when you win that tournament, it's really, really good. Well, I think we're about
Yeah.
wrapped up here. Is there anything else you would like to share? Maybe what you're working on next, or anything else to anybody who might be out there listening or watching,
Um,
actually?
or watching. Yeah. No. I've got a bunch of fires. I've got a bunch of irons in the fire, as it were. But right now, I'm just focused on getting the revised version of Shadow Bridge out through Bookview this summer, and after that, I'll look at new things that I'm playing around with, or I have a supernatural Western that's drafted and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with that yet. It needs revising. It needs, help.
Mm-hmm.
And
It's in that ugly part. We get
it's
it.
in that ugly part. It'll keep though for now. It's not going anywhere. So yeah, I've got some ideas for some other stories, some other novels, and I'll get around to them.
That's just excellent. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. I
Sure.
really, really appreciate it. I know I learned a lot and I've been doing this a long time. So I really, really appreciate you spending time with me today.
Well, thanks very much, Michelle. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you so much for watching, writers. And if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. That helps more writers find us here on the Novelists Inc. channel, where we post a video every week about the craft and business of writing professionally. See you next time.